In this video, we'll talk about plagiarism, and I think you probably know something about what plagiarism is. It's some kind of theft, and in fact, we typically define academic plagiarism as the theft of ideas and words, and you pass these ideas and words off as your own. And that's seen as quite a crime, actually. Now, you might be surprised by those words because you might be thinking, well, it's not the same as, let's say, stealing a car, right? If you look at this picture here, if I go to a website and I steal a few ideas, well, surely that can't be quite as bad. But often the penalties for plagiarism are very severe. So in the university setting, if you were to plagiarize once, you might receive an F on a paper, unless you maybe plagiarize just one phrase or a sentence. But if you plagiarize quite a lot of your paper, you might receive an F. If you did it again, you might be kicked out of the institution. Okay, so you might have to leave the university. And then if you were in the real world, although real is kind of a funny word there, you might lose your job. So you might lose your job and your reputation. And there are countless examples of this out there. Okay, so one famous example that springs to mind, in 2013, the German education minister lost her job because it was found out that she had plagiarized her PhD dissertation. And the irony is that it was a dissertation on the development of the conscience. Clearly she didn't learn too much there. Now that we have a general idea of what plagiarism is, we want to define it a little bit more specifically. So one of the things that plagiarism includes is what's called paraphrasing without citing. Okay, so citing is giving your sources, and paraphrasing is putting things in your own words. So just because it's not word for word doesn't mean it's not plagiarism. Another thing that constitutes plagiarism is reusing your own work, and that might come as a bit of a surprise. Okay, reusing your own work. So if you're in one class and you do a project and you think, well, this is great, I got a great mark for it, and then another teacher asks you to do an assignment and you resubmit that work, that's still considered plagiarism. Now, it might be hard for the professor to find out about that, but it is important to start having these ethical standards because, for instance, in the world of journalism, so this is especially important in journalism, it can happen that you write a piece for one newspaper, let's say, and then you get commissioned to write something similar. It can be tempting to take the same ideas, but in effect, you've already sold your ideas and your words to that newspaper. They own the copyright, so to speak, and that's why you have to be very careful about reusing your own work. Now, another form of plagiarism is where you use the same argument as somebody else, but you didn't use any kind of phrases or sections of the original paper word for word. So even when you use the same argument, the same ideas in the same order, and you don't cite where you got that argument from, it's still considered plagiarism. And then one more here, just to flesh this out a little bit. If you have insufficient citation, so insufficient citation, let's say that you borrow some ideas, maybe some phrases from a particular source, and you do cite the article or the website in your works cited page, but not in the body of your essay. That's still considered plagiarism. So you have to be very careful that you cite both in the body of your paper and at the very end. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is really difficult. How do I know when to cite and when not to cite? Do I have to be super careful and cite everything that I find? You just have to be honest about what you do. And we'll look at some more detail now at some trickier cases here. Okay, so let's first look at what's called lazy paraphrasing. Okay, so if you look at this example here, we read Bob West grew up on a steady diet of action novels, and let's say that this is the quotation that you're using or that you've found, and now you've decided to paraphrase it in your own essay, and it reads Bob's West youth included a steady diet of action novels, and then you have the citation here. Now you might be thinking, well, that's enough to avoid plagiarism. right? I've cited it. You can see where it's from. The page is there. And I've put it in my own words. But it's not quite enough here. So you can see this phrase here, a steady diet of action novels. And we still have this exact phrase here. We haven't changed it at all. So as soon as you have 2 or 3 words that are still the same in the same order, especially if they're fairly specific and unique kind of words, then you need to make sure that you use quotation marks, okay? Or change it up enough that these are definitely your own words. But you don't have to panic entirely, because some people go overboard and they start citing every last bit. If things are what's called common knowledge, then you do not have to cite them. So there's a few examples here. Let's say you're talking about JFK, John F. Kennedy, and you want to say that he was killed in 1963. Well, everybody knows that, right? You can easily look that up. There's no need to cite that. Incidentally, C.S. Lewis died on the same day, which is sort of an interesting fact. Henry VIII's first wife was Catherine of Aragon. All of these kinds of details, including scientific details and proverbs, you don't have to cite these. If they are universally known, if these are things that you can, everybody knows from their youth, or you can find it in many a textbook, and in each case nobody's citing this information, then it's pretty clear that this is common knowledge and you don't have to cite it. So try to make that distinction, but if you're in doubt, so let's say you're dealing with a statistic that's a bit more contentious, let's say you're talking about the age of the universe, is it 13.7 billion years old? Well, some people would say that, but there might be different kind of accounts. So maybe that's where it starts to become important that you do give an accurate citation. Let's finish by talking about what actually causes plagiarism. So why do people plagiarize? And then how we can prevent it. So what might be some tips for prevention? Now, what causes plagiarism can be any number of things. You might say, well, it's laziness, though in my experience that's often not the case. You might say, well, it's bad assignments. If a teacher gives an assignment and you can just Google it right away and find the answer online, that's the teacher's fault. And sometimes that's true. You can blame it on the internet then, and that might be a factor, but I think people have always plagiarized. You can blame it on panic, last minute panic. Okay? You can blame it on pressure, and I've seen every excuse in the book over the years. My parents are pressuring me, I have to get a good job, I have to do this, and so on. Might be a factor. You might blame it on a lack of research skills. So no research skills. Nobody ever taught me this. And that's probably true to some extent. But if you've watched this video, then you definitely are not innocent. And then the last one is a lack of self-confidence. So a lack of confidence. And I would say that in many cases, this is the root cause of plagiarism. You don't think you can do it yourself. So what you do is you look it up online, you look for a crutch, and before you know it, you've plagiarized it. And then you feel bad, but you feel bad not just because you stole something, but you feel bad because you think that you are a failure. And I'd like to tell you that you are not the only person who thinks this. There are many, many people. Well, that sounds bad. It sounds like lots of people think you're a failure. But what I mean is that there are many people who go through this struggle because citing sources, doing academic papers is difficult. And so don't just rely on yourself in order to solve this problem. Okay? If you want to prevent plagiarism, you have to do a number of things beyond just citing your sources, obviously. You need to give yourself enough time to do the assignment. Don't leave it to the last minute. You also need to seek help. If you don't feel confident, seek help. And I don't just mean go to your friends and ask them to read your paper or ask to borrow their paper. What I mean is go to a writing center. Most universities have these on campus. Often they're found in the library. Or go see your instructor. Okay? Go see your instructor. And I mean that very seriously. There are so few people who go and see their instructor that it's almost scandalous. And the ones who do are often the best students. which is kind of ironic because they might not even need the help. So if you need the help, go and seek out your instructor. They have office hours set aside for this, and they are willing to help by and large. Now, you might find the odd rotten instructor who doesn't like to help students, but that's an exception. When I have students come in, I'm just so glad to help them. It's the best part of my job because I can actually work one-on-one with that student to make them a better writer. And that's great for both parties. So seek out help and don't be ashamed to do it multiple times. And then the last one is trust. Now, you might have heard of Pavlov's dogs, right? That little experiment that's often talked about in sociology and psychology. It's where Pavlov trained his dogs to listen to the bell so that when he gave them food, they knew that the bell would sound, and then they would start to salivate in response. And over time, he could ring the bell and make them salivate even when there was no food. That's how a lot of people do research. As soon as they get that assignment, well, they don't salivate. They're not too eager to do it, but they right away Google it. Google is the response to everything, right? Just Google it, we say. You have to resist that tendency. When you get an assignment, don't Google it. Trust yourself that you can do it. Take the time, think about it before you do any research or what's considered research, and come up with some ideas by yourself. And I think you can do that.